Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to talk about Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman is the New York Times great philosopher, an artist, and scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. And we would like to welcome you today to our amazing topic as well. And we would also give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, Americans based Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your comments, ask questions, and give your feedback. We will definitely address that in the end, and also the questions will be answered in the next session. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaliyah, as always. I also want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty. I want to thank Elmira, Dana, the entire team, the staff that makes these talks possible on a weekly basis, provides a philosophical perspective on a wide range of topics, a wide range of issues, often connected to international days, sometimes to current events, sometimes to historical events, but always from a philosophical perspective of not opinion or point of view or belief or faith, but rigor. And that will be true of this morning's talk as well. It is entitled The Olympics and the acme, the highest point of perfection, what rigor allows, demands. And in fact, this talk is mostly focused upon the Olympic figure skater, the great figure skater, Kamila Valieva. So I've been focused upon the Olympics. I've been focused upon her career, her performances in the last few months, and that will be the specific focus of today's talk. As a way of introduction, this is the music that Valieva would use during her short program of skating. It's an emotional piece. It's by Carol Richter. It's titled In Memoriam. It's moving. Well, philosophy, the extremity of rigor, the limit of rigor, shares extremities with limits of performance in different directions, in every direction. The introduction to the books of Joshua, that poetic, narrative, autobiographical, philosophical, that I wrote some years ago, begins with an introduction that frames this issue very broadly and deeply. I'm going to begin by reading this introduction. It may seem not specifically focused upon the issue of skating in the Olympics, but broadly and deeply it is, because it deals with the mission of philosophy, its precision, its aspirations that are only achievable at the limit of rigor in the way that performances can only satisfy our ultimate needs at their highest level of perfection, of attainment. So let me read this. It's a little bit long. Some of it I've used in previous talks, some of it. It might take a minute and a half or so to read, so just bear with the length. But I'm doing this because, again, I think this talk needs this appropriate framing. So let me get my glasses And I will mostly read, some of this I know by heart, but I will mostly read it. So this is the introduction to the books of Joshua, a philosophical, autobiographical, poetic narrative. Before the beginning. The writing of the philosophy began 25 years ago, almost to the day, in a swimming pool. And it began with this. Mark Fidrich, the pitcher, an American baseball pitcher, with bases loaded and the game in the balance, calmed his nerves with thoughts of universal death in 10 or 20 billion years. Shakespeare, and more clearly still Sakyamuni, future Buddha, discern that if all is time and time is change, neither time nor change could be what they appear, could be anything at all. The world of the Western God seen from on high, as of the Buddha seen from anywhere, is a world without concepts. In such a world, from such a perspective, disease, old age, and death find resolution. But this surely is our world too. And so the question returns, what is time? Experiences such as John von Neumann's sustain the development, the philosophical development. Von Neumann worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb, designed the ENIAC, the first electronic computer, created game theory, won a Nobel Prize, and screamed himself to death. Not from the physical pain of the prostate cancer that would take his life. Drugs, then as now, could control such pain, but from the mental anguish of the dying process. Physicians say candidly, no one dies well. Dying is death by 1,000 cuts, which remains the most horrific of tortures, not as commonly misunderstood, bleeding to death from 1,000 nicks, but the progressive and inexorable disembodiment of the human personality. Officials cordoned off the wing of the hospital where John von Neumann lay dying, fearing that in his anguish, he'd scream out national security secrets. Von Neumann was a Catholic. Priests came to comfort him, but to no avail. And we shouldn't be surprised. Belief, faith, a point of view are not enough to address the extremity of human suffering. When Jesus on the cross cries out in despair, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Christianity failed its most important test. The faith would have ended then and there had there been something stronger. The issue affects more than a moment of dying. As Siddhartha and the Greeks of classical antiquity knew, and as survivors of extreme torture have written, and there have not been many, the horrific is retroactive and can undermine the entire previous reality of one's life, transmuting existence into pain, so that one will wish, with all of one's heart and soul, never to have been born. Faith and belief are not strong enough. It has taken 2,000 years of intellectual development to produce something that is. Only the extremity of rigor can satisfy our needs. Only the incontrovertible, irresistible solves the world. Only at that extreme embodiment of rigorous representation does philosophy achieve what we want it to achieve, what we need it to achieve, a complete solution to human life, but only at that limit. In the same way, it's only at the absolute limit of performance that performance achieves the transcendence that can embody that resolution, that solution to the world, that we can see it, that we can experience it, even if only briefly, momentarily. Philosophy aims to allow you to experience it moment to moment, wherever you are, at each point and moment of your life. But performances at the highest level can achieve an embody it at that moment, at that time, at that place, and then the recollection of that experience can inspire. Well, theisms, beliefs in deity, in God, are universal convergences. Even polytheisms, where there's multiplicities of gods, involve convergent operations, convergent types of representations. Hinduism is the most famous of the contemporary polytheisms. There are many gods, and throughout different parts of Hindu culture, there are variations in the gods that are worshipped. They have, in Hinduism, 3 supreme deities: Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma. But there is that sense of universal convergence. All things point to God, point to deity. All things become one. There's a famous Hindu, it's a saying, takes different specific forms, but here's one such form of it, that we go to a concert, musical performance, not to hear Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist, not to experience the music of Bach, the great composer, but to experience God. Now, Yo-Yo Ma, Bach are conduits. They lead us to that. There's a reason why they are imagined to lead us to that preferentially. And the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, one of the central works of Hindu religiosity, one of the most beautiful works of Hindu religiosity, makes the point emphatic. And here it's a dialogue, effectively, between God, the supreme deity, Vishnu, in the form of the avatar Krishna, to the warrior Arjuna, who is reluctant to engage in battle. And Krishna has come to him in order to give him encouragement, to give him the perspective of the divine. And he reveals himself to Arjuna in the following words. Among rivers, I am the Ganges. Among purifiers, I am the wind. I am time without end, and I am death. I am death that seizes all, and the source of all that shall be born. I am beautiful speech, memory, steadfastness, and forgiveness, and the silence of things secret. The point is that, as in deism, which was the Enlightenment representation of religious belief, religious faith, that the founding fathers of the United States subscribed to. They weren't so much Christians or any other established, developed faith. They were deists. They believed that God was everywhere. God manifested himself, herself, itself, in every aspect of the world. Well, Hinduism believes that, sees that, understands that, but even more pointedly sees God, the divine, as manifesting itself in the greatest aspects or dimensions of experience, in the greatest of rivers, in the greatest of philosophers, in the greatest of performances. That's where we most directly in this world encounter divinity, most purely, most clearly, most strongly, in the greatest of whatever the category is. Some years ago, I had a girlfriend for 8 years who happened to be a figure skater, an Olympic aspirant. She was on a course that she hoped would end at the Olympics. It turns out she, at some point, decided that she would rather pursue a career in biomedical research and in medicine. So she left figure skating because of the extraordinary commitment. You know, it's something that it's hard to do other things while one is aiming at that level, that Olympic level of skating excellence, precision. But through her, well, she trained with Olympic gold medalists. She knew Olympic gold medalists. We went to performances. I met backstage Olympic gold medalists in figure skating. We would watch the Olympics together, she and I, and I became adept at evaluating performance. It was something that I followed consistently and enthusiastically and drew inspiration from. In fact, my public talks on philosophy began in February of 2014. So, what, eight years ago now? 8 years ago this month, almost to the day. And they actually began at the gallery that represents me. It was a large gallery space, enough to accommodate several hundred people. And I did a lot of advertising promotion for this talk I was going to be giving, this initial talk, excuse me, explaining my philosophical works. And it was well attended. There was actually a downpour in Los Angeles, torrential rain. Right before it began, we thought 15 minutes in, there'd be a handful of people, but after half an hour or so, it was overflowing with people. So it was an event that I had been anticipating, had been planning for. It ended up being a 2.5-hour talk, unscripted. And since it was my first such presentation, I was nervous. Right? I did a lot of preparation, but I was nervous because there was going to be no script. That was at the time of the Sochi Olympics. And I was following figure skating at that time. You know, as I was preparing, I was diverting my mind by watching the Olympic competition. And in particular, the figure skating, that was the Olympics of Una Kim and Adelina Sotnikova, the Russian. I was a fan of Una Kim's, and I thought she skated well during the Olympics, but I thought her skating lacked a certain measure of, well, the extremity of performance. I didn't find it quite as emotionally moving as I had experienced from her performances in the past. On the other hand, in the finals, in the free skate, as it's called, the long skating program, the 4-minute skate, Adelina Sotnikova delivered what I thought was an inspired performance that earned her the gold medal. It was an unexpected result, but I thought it was earned. There was a lot of controversy about it because Una Kim had an enormous fan base, and deservedly so. But I happened to find Sotnikova's performance overall superior, and I thought it justified that level of acclamation, the gold. I had it recorded on my television, and I must have watched that performance of hers at least a dozen times, maybe 20 times, leading up to my actual talk, because I found it calming and inspiring. That's the role that figure skating has played in my life, partly again because of that girlfriend I had who introduced me to its intricacies and its aspirations. This October, I began watching this past October, like 5 months ago, I began watching the major figure skating events of the end of the season, things like the Finlandia trophy, the European Championships, Skate Canada. There were like 4 major skating competitions from October through January. The European Championships were in January, leading up to the Olympics in February. At these performances, at these competitions, for the first time, I saw Kamila Valieva skate. The very first time I saw her, it was epical. Johnny Weir is an American figure skater. He, I think, won our national championships several times. He was a bronze medalist at the Olympics. I think he'd gone to 2 Olympic competitions. He is the main commentator for figure skating in the United States for American audiences. So he was the commentator for all of these international competitions that I was watching. He was the commentator during the Olympics. He's usually paired with Tara Lipinski, who was an American skater who won Olympic gold at the age of 15. They're both intelligent, perceptive. Johnny Weir in particular is compelling. He's astute. He is clearly demonstrates high standards of evaluation. One can learn from his commentary and be inspired by his commentary. His reaction to Kamila Valieva's skating, event after event, competition after competition, took the form of, and I'm not quite quoting, but I'm paraphrasing. He said that in his lifetime, he did not expect to see anyone at her level of athleticism, of artistry, of precision, of commitment, of elegance. Not in his lifetime. He thought she represented a quantum leap, an order of magnitude beyond anything we had seen and anything he could imagine seeing. I mean, he ran out of acclamations, ran out of ways to praise her, performance after performance. Tara Lipinski at one point said that her skating could inspire the world. So we're talking about something at that supreme level, and that's how I experienced it. I had never seen anything like it in terms of the precision of her jumps, quad jumps, in terms of her sensitivity to the music. She was a ballerina on ice, a prima ballerina on ice. And if you go online and look at comments, messages, in relation to her performances, recordings of her performances, you'll see the most extreme praise. The general consensus on the part of people that seem to, again, be well informed about skating, the history of skating, is that she represented the greatest talent in the history of the sport. She entered 4 major competitions. Those, I think I named 3 of them: the the Ross Telecom Cup was the fourth major competition that she entered. She entered 4 major competitions beginning in October when she first emerged on the senior skating circuit at the age of 15, which I guess is the age at which you can enter that level of competition. She had won juniors in the past. She had set world records at the juniors, but now she was skating at the highest level of international competition. She won all of her competitions. She won them all by wide margins in her scores, and she set world records. She set 8 world records at these 4 competitions. She currently holds the world record for short program, it's 2 minutes and 40 seconds, give or take. The free skate, the long skating program, it's 4 minutes, and the overall score for both together. She holds the world record in each one of those categories of performance. There's an American sports writer whom I read in relation to her results, her emergence. He used the example of Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds is a great American baseball player. He actually set the most cherished record in baseball, the number of home runs in a season, at 73. Babe Ruth had set the record that lasted for 35 years of 60. And then that was broken. It was broken a few more times. But finally, Barry Bonds, about 20 years ago, set the record as it currently stands of 73 home runs a year. The sports writer said that what Valieva did was not Barry Bonds hitting 73 home runs in a season. It was Barry Bonds hitting 73 home runs in the first month of his rookie season. His first season. It was an unprecedented level of performance, but a level of performance that in terms of the beauty, in terms of the precision, in terms of, again, what she was able to achieve on the ice, inspiring and unprecedented. I want to tell you a couple of stories to give some perspective on what's going to be coming a little bit later in the talk. I had a cousin, I just actually found out this past week. I was looking for, let me show you. I think there are probably some images I should show. Let me see here. I know I sometimes forget to show these images. Oh, okay. In that introduction to the books of Joshua, I mentioned that picture. Mark Fidrich, well, here's the baseball pitcher, the one who calmed his mind with thoughts of universal death in 10 or 20 billion years. He was a little bit eccentric of personality. Here's John von Neumann, the brilliant 20th century mathematician, physicist who screamed himself to death. There is Valieva. And another image of Valieva. There is an image of Johnny Weir, the commentator, who said that he had not in his lifetime seen or expected to see anyone approaching her level. Okay. I had a cousin, a prominent physician, academician, very smart, very wise, that I used to have lunch with. He used to be my personal physician until he retired some years ago. And then there was a period of time for a number of years when we would meet once a week and have lunch. He liked to go to different restaurants. I lived in Marina del Rey, which has lots of restaurants, among the greatest concentration of restaurants of any place in the United States. So there are lots of different restaurants to choose from. So we would go to a different restaurant each week. And after lunch, again, he was a physician, he was an endocrinologist. He liked to take walks. Now, it's a recommendation, actually. It helps maintain blood sugar levels if you take a little walk after you've eaten. So it was one of his protocols. He would always take a walk, no matter whether we went out to lunch, out to dinner. It would be, no matter what the weather was, we would take a walk afterwards. Okay, he saw a lot of patients suffering from diabetes, and that was one way of helping prevent its development. So, and we would talk about all manner of subject. As I said, he was very smart, very well read. He was a writer, he was a poet. His family was accomplished. His sister was actually a well-known Hollywood producer, writer of television. Another sister was a prominent visual artist. So he was exposed to high levels of artistic performance and achievement, as well as being schooled in the sciences and having very high standards. It was extremely hard to elicit praise from his cousin. Well, one day we were walking and we were talking about Van Gogh. And I was writing something at the time, and I was talking about how philosophers tended not to commit suicide in the way that artists often or famously did. There were lots of famous instances of artists committing suicide, like Van Gogh, Mark Rothko. It's a long list, actually. Whereas in the history of philosophy, it's relatively rare. When it has happened, Socrates and Seneca, it's been under very particular circumstances where effectively they were condemned to death. And so they were condemned to commit suicide. So it wasn't quite like they committed suicide in despair. Otherwise, it's rare. And in my thesis, explaining the difference between artists and philosophers in relation to their work is that philosophers live inside their ideas or seeing the world through their ideas. So if their ideas are strong, then it buttresses, the philosopher. It provides support in the face of the challenges that experience presents. Whereas an artist, a painter, is looking at his canvases across the room on the wall. He's not living inside of his work in the way that the philosopher is living inside his ideas. So I made the comment that Van Gogh's art had ultimately failed Van Gogh. It didn't prevent him from committing suicide. It didn't buttress him sufficiently. And my cousin's response was, Van Gogh's art didn't fail Van Gogh. The people around Van Gogh failed Van Gogh. Another story, Confucius. Confucius is widely considered the greatest mind in the history of Chinese civilization. And I've read, obviously not in the original languages, but in translation, a fair amount of Chinese writing, philosophy in particular. And I understand that appraisal. I'm not in a position to make that type of claim and fully support it, but based on the Analects, based on Confucius's work, I have not encountered the writings of another Chinese figure, Chinese philosopher, Chinese intellectual that for me rises to the level of Confucius. Confucius spent the last 20 years or so of his life traveling around the Chinese countryside, looking for governments that would adopt his ideas, test them, implement them. He had one government earlier on in his life, but it didn't quite work out. Okay, so now he was trying again, and he devoted the last 20 years of his life to that effort. And he had one particular, now there are different stories about this, so I'm telling one account that I read. Had one particular disciple that was much younger, that supported him, was his accompaniment, on these travels. At some point, that disciple contracted typhus and died. Now, Confucius was alone. He was elderly, early 70s, and effectively, in despair, he gave up. The greatest mind in the history of Chinese civilization gave up. And the form that his mind took was not in the direction of the sciences, which don't necessarily console, but in the direction of among the most powerful writings about the nature of the human condition and responses to the human condition that exist. Gave up. The point is that with insufficient support or sufficient opposition, anyone can fail, no matter what. No matter how great, no matter how overwhelming one's talents or abilities, with insufficient support or sufficient opposition to the nature of heuristic space, convergence theory, one can fail. If Confucius considered himself to have failed, in a sense he did in terms of not being able to achieve the implementation, the adoption of his work, anyone can fail. If Van Gogh can fail, can in his lifetime sell just one painting for $80 when he was at the center of the late 19th century Parisian art renaissance, when his brother was an art dealer in Paris, when Van Gogh was being supported by his brother, when Van Gogh knew all the major figures of the art world. If Van Gogh, with his level of dedication and commitment and intellectual power, as we see in his writings, can fail, anyone can fail with insufficient support or sufficient opposition. And when that happens, now we tend to think that there are so many people on earth that everyone's replaceable. No one's replaceable. When I've sometimes given talks about why we don't have a fully sort of functioning cancer cure at this point. And I've pointed out that as much as any reason, of course, we can't go back and do controlled experiments and determine exactly what the decisive factor is or is not. But I make the point that a Roman soldier against orders killed Archimedes, killed the greatest mind of antiquity, killed a man considered one of the three greatest mathematicians in history, and it took 2,000 years for his successor to emerge, for Isaac Newton to emerge to carry on the work in the development of calculus that Archimedes had begun. And what was the response to Newton? He was ridiculed, he was laughed at by the Royal Society for his ideas on the nature of light. And so Newton retired to his rooms at Cambridge and didn't publish for a generation. And then Lavoisier, the great French chemist, was guillotined during the French Revolution. You kill Archimedes, kill Lavoisier, you laugh at Newton, you don't get a cancer cure. I mean, you see the point. I'm using that somewhat metaphorically. But we have not seen Van Gogh's successor. We lost Mozart at 36. We've not seen another Mozart, not at that level. We haven't had another Shakespeare. It might take 1,000 years or more to produce somebody with all the qualities that make Van Gogh perhaps the most embraced great painter in history. It may take another 2,000 years to produce somebody with the full complement of abilities and sensibilities that Mozart had, that we lost at 36. Nadia Comaneci was the star, the gymnast, the Romanian gymnast, was the star of the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. She achieved perfection, right? She received, I think, 7 scores of 10. That was gymnastics perfection at that time. I've seen those performances. You can see them, online. They represent the rarest of achievements, a level of perfection that we had not seen before and have not seen since. It's been said that Simone Biles, the American gymnast, is the greatest gymnast in history. Well, in terms of the difficulty of what she does, she's doing things in advance of what Nadia Comaneci did. The sport evolves. The expectations grow. But in terms of precision, in terms of perfection, there is Nadia Comaneci and only Nadia Comaneci. And that is a slender moment in time, a fragile moment in time. Nadia Comaneci did not achieve that level of perfection, not quite, again. Valieva was expected to win gold in Beijing. Again, she entered not having lost a senior competition. She entered with world records in every category by a wide margin. And as I was saying earlier, people were at a loss for how to praise her level of, let's call it, genius in skating. She actually led her team, the Russian Olympic team, to, first place in the team competition. The record-setting performance that she had done prior to the Olympics in the short program scored a 90.45, just to give you the number. She was the first person ever to reach 90. I think in previous competitions, she had been the first person ever to reach 80. But 90.45, I'm not sure about the 80, but 90.45 was the record. I think when she set that record, like a month or so earlier, the next competitor scored like 76. That's the gap between Valieva and the competition. In the Olympics, in the short program, she scored 90.18. So just a little bit below her world record in that short skate, but still the only other score above 90 in the history of skating. She, in the long skate, again, she helped her team to first place. And she landed the first 2 quads, 4 rotations in the history of Olympic competition for a woman. Well, right after that team competition, it was revealed that a sample, a urine sample, taken in December 25th, so at the end of December, tested positive for a trace That's how it was described. A trace of a prohibited substance. The substance is trimetazidine. I know, as you know, I have a little bit of a background in medicine and molecular biology, so I know something about trimetazidine and drug testing. I'll talk about that in a second. It's a drug that enhances blood flow. It's given to cardiac patients, elderly, typically cardiac patients. It's not legally used in the United States within the medical profession, but it's very commonly used, certainly in Russia, maybe in Europe as well. It's a prescribed medication for a certain type of heart failure, basically. Turns out her grandfather, with whom either she lives or spends a great deal of time, is on that medication. And in fact, that is one reason why she maintains that if there was contamination, it might have been through that proximate association. Well, when that result was revealed, the impact was seismic, as you can imagine. Seismic. Given, the caliber, given this is the woman, who had transformed figure skating in terms of what was possible, who had achieved what no one thought they would ever see achieved in that sport. But initially, the Russian Olympic Committee banned her, then she appealed. The ban was overturned, so she was permitted to skate, but then the International Olympic Committee appealed that reversal, and the case went to CAS, C-A-S, the Court of Arbitration for Sport. That is the highest body of adjudication, of decision-making for such incidents involving doping, taking illegal drugs, incidents involving, any type of legal controversy or controversy that rises to legal considerations within the world of sport, certainly within the realm of Olympic sports and competition. I think the court was established in 1983 in Switzerland, a neutral country, famously. It has, for its adjudication panel, 3 judges that are selected from a pool of judges. One of the judges that decided the Valieva case was an American, in fact. It was done remotely. There was an 8-hour hearing at which Valieva spoke from Beijing. There was deliberation after it. The decision, the judges decided that, given first the fact that she was a minor, under 16, that's a minor within the world of sports or within the world of Olympic competition. Given that she was under 16, she qualified as a protected person. That means normal rules don't apply to her, including normal rules about drug contamination, positive results. It's understood or it's felt that for someone of that age, they might not be fully aware of what they're taking or the implications of what they're taking. In any case, it's within the regulations of the world of Olympic sports. Under 16, you have special status. You're a protected person. In addition, there was a 6-week delay between when the sample was taken and when the results were released. That raised questions. Why such a delay? In addition, there is the possibility of random contamination. That was Valieva's explanation. She was around someone, close to someone, living with someone that was using that medication. It was a trace amount. could be false positive. Well, the decision of Cass, of that 3-judge panel, was that she should be allowed to skate. We will investigate further, but all things taken into consideration, she will continue to skate in these Olympics. Then we can evaluate more fully, more deeply the circumstances. We can consider, her account, of exactly how this may have come about, but she needs to be allowed to skate. Now, a few things about that decision. When I say could be a false positive, I'm not joking about that. We make decisions often influenced by our background, by experiences that we've had that make strong impressions upon us. Well, I was in medical school, as you know. When I entered medical school, I had also been in a PhD program in molecular biology. I was studying molecular biology, so I'd been spending a lot of time in the laboratory. I had a lot of laboratory experience. In medical school, I had to take a biochemistry course. I'd already taken a biochemistry course as part of my graduate work in molecular biology. So turns out there were a class of 100, I think, about 45, 44 students at UCLA School of Medicine. There were, I think, 8 of us that had especially strong backgrounds in biochemistry, in molecular biology, in laboratory science. And so we were placed in a special section of this biochemistry course that was required in medical school, where we did special projects, projects of like more sophisticated, more detailed types of investigations. Just 8 of us under, with 1 or 2 prominent professors in biochemistry. So again, it was a privileged group, honestly. One week, we investigated, drug testing, but in particular, cholesterol level testing. And, we were involved in, sort of working out mechanisms. And the idea was to fully understand everything about the test at a level that normally, would not be done in medical school. And as part of this, we all tested ourselves. And, these sessions were intense because, again, we all had sort of extensive backgrounds. What was remarkable, what was instructive about that session, that experience, was every single one of us, all 8 of us, tested false positive for extraordinarily high levels of cholesterol. Every single result was wrong. Every single result was a false positive. 8 out of 8 results were false positives, and here we were some of the most experienced working students in that environment, working with some of the most experienced professors, biochemists, pharmacologists in that environment. That teaches a lesson. There can always be false positives. Same thing applies here. So when I hear, our mind tends to be captivated by first impressions. It's a positive result, and so it's definitive. That experience taught me one of the fundamental lessons of philosophy: presumption. We presume more than we know, as if there were no time. So whenever I hear a positive result, I recoil and say, let's do it again. Let's investigate. Let's make sure, especially when it's a consequential result, like at the level of one of the great performers in the history of the Olympics. In terms of the drug itself, it doesn't have the kind of effects that, for example, steroids have, where they can change your basic tissue structure, where they can build muscle, and the resulting accumulation of muscle stays with you. So it enhances performance over a period of time. That particular drug happens to have a very short half-life, has a metabolic effect. It's only effective while it is in your system. She had a trace amount. The half-life of that drug typically is 6 to 12 hours, but that's usually in the population for which it's given, which is an elderly population. Typically, younger people metabolize drugs much more rapidly. And so in someone of her age, that might have a half-life of a few hours. That will be gone. Now, she tested negative for that drug at the Olympics. So in terms of the effect that that drug would have on her performance at the Olympics, based on a trace amount from a month and a half earlier with a half-life of some small number of hours relatively, well, you see the point. And the ultimate point is the judges decided she will skate based on a whole battery of considerations. Now, there's an American sprinter that immediately commented upon that result. The sprinter's name is Sha'Carri Richardson. Let me show you. Oh, I mentioned Van Gogh. There's Van Gogh. Mentioned Confucius. There's Confucius, a sculpture. We don't exactly know what he looks like, but that looks like a good representation. I mentioned, oh, did I mention Beethoven? I didn't. Okay, sorry, I skipped that. Okay, here's the drug, trimetazidine. It's a simple molecule. We don't exactly know fully how it works, the full mechanism of action. That's true for a lot of drugs. Just know it does. Here is Sha'Carri Richardson. She's a sprinter, an American sprinter, a gifted sprinter, an accomplished sprinter. She was actually the favorite, or one of the favorites, to win gold in like the 100-meter dash, maybe the 200-meter dash, in the Summer Olympics 2020, the Tokyo Olympics that were held in 2021. But right before the Olympics, she tested positive for cannabis, marijuana, a banned substance. And she was banned for a month, which meant she couldn't participate in the Olympics. Her comment relative to Valieva's positive drug test and then the court decision to allow her to continue to participate in the Olympics for, again, a list of considerations, a list of reasons, was, what's the difference between me and Valieva, except I am black and Valieva is white? She raises a race issue. Now, philosophy has a response to that, right? And actually, there was a spokesman for the International Olympic Committee that felt the need to respond, and he responded in the manner that philosophy would respond, that I would respond. Remember, the basic issue of philosophy is rigor. And what is rigor? Rigor is of difference. And I use that line from Shakespeare. I'll teach you differences. Well, that would be my response. That was the response on the part of the Olympic Committee. I'll teach you differences. There were, this spokesman went on to say, more differences than similarities between your case and Valieva's. At the very least, she's a protected person. She's under 16. We have a special legal category for such people. You were 20 or 21. You tested positive right before the Olympics. She tested negative for that drug right before the Olympics or during the Olympics. The positive test was from a month and a half earlier, unrelated to the Olympics itself. It's a drug with a short half-life. It's likely gone from your system, and its effects are likely null at the time of Olympic performance, and on and on. The point is, and I've made this point, and this is the important philosophic point always to keep in mind, the redemptive philosophical point. Between any two human beings, I'm standing here, somebody else is standing a few feet away, there are enough differences. There are more differences than similarities in terms of the rigor of our circumstance, the rigor of our condition, and it's those differences. I am in an entirely different environment, or there are enough differences that pertain, right? Every single point that I am in relation to has a different relationality to somebody standing 2 feet away. There are more differences than similarities in any two situations involving any two human beings under no matter what set of circumstances. Now, you might say, well, that's the case. How can we ever evaluate? How can we ever judge? And the point is, philosophically, rigorously, we cannot. That's the nature of philosophic space. Philosophic space is extreme. The performances I'm talking about on the part of Algebra are extreme. It's only the extreme that is redemptive and transcendent. It's only the extreme in philosophy that can solve the riddle of the world for us, that can end the pain of our circumstances, only taken to the absolute extreme. There's a religious admonition within Christianity, thou shalt not judge. It's an admonition, a stipulation by God. But philosophically, rigorously, it's the nature of our circumstance. That rigorously, any two circumstances are different, and so whatever applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other, and we cannot judge. Okay, well, despite these decisions, despite these responses on the part of the Olympic Committee, despite this decision on the part of this independent panel of judges at the highest court of arbitration in sports, there was a continuing outcry against Valieva, a continuing bullying of Valieva now I'm mostly privy to American media, but on the part of the American press, on the part of the commentators, Johnny Weir and Tara Lipinski, on the part of their commentary, one heard over and over and over and over again, she should not be allowed to continue competing. I have a friend who said the same thing. I would have decided differently. I would not have let her compete. And I explained to him, well, you might have made a different decision. And how do we view that? Well, the judges on that panel that decided she should be allowed to continue to compete have different experiences, life experiences than you have. Those judges have a legal background and legal perspectives that you do not have. Those judges have different neurophysiologies than you have. That might result in a different decision. But beyond that, they might be privy to facts that you are not aware of. So that if you were on that panel of judges making a decision, given those facts that they may be privy to, or the background that they might have been exposed to that you do not have knowledge of, you might have decided according as they decided. Again, we are stuffed full of presumption, right? When we make all manner of decision and evaluation and judgment. Philosophy at the limit of rigor, like religion within its deistic embrace, stops that mode of judgment. It silences us when it comes to that type of destructive judgment. Again, it's a strange world that philosophy is seeing, in the same way that the world of Buddhist enlightenment does not look like the world of common sense experience that human beings encounter. But again, that's the price of a complete solution. It's not common sense. It's not the normal world. There's something different about it. A rigorous space is not the space that you're seeing on a daily basis. Remember, I've emphasized, if there's anything around you that you can describe, that you can name, you are seeing heuristic space, not epistemic space. You're seeing not the reality, but your representation and oversimplification of it. It's within that space, that oversimplified space, that you suffer and that you judge. Okay, well, so the bullying continued. The controversy continued. I found it reprehensible because, again, it ran in the face of fundamental philosophical principles. We presume more than we know. We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. The cacophony, the bullying was not just something that had the possibility of undermining Valliere. So ultimately the source of suffering in the lives of all the people that are generating that negativity, expressing that hostility, expressing that condemnation. The point is, once the decision was made to let her skate by the highest court of arbitration in the sport, let her skate. Don't presume more than you know. Now, she takes the ice, right, for her free skate. Having entered the short program, even after this controversy, resulted in her leading, the women's competition, entering the second phase of the competition, the long skate, the free skate, the 4-minute performance. In the short program, the 2-minute and 40-second performance, she didn't reach her world record level of 90, 90.18, 90.45, but she was in the 80s, 82, still enough to lead the competition by several points. Okay? So we see a slight diminution in the level of performance, but she's still leading. Right? But again, with sufficient opposition or insufficient support, anyone can fail. Confucius could fail. Beethoven made the comment, I was going to mention this earlier, but I'll insert it here, made the comment that when you are dealing with young people, when you are dealing with anybody, you must be careful in your criticism. That criticism can undermine anyone and deprive us of the fulfillment of someone of extraordinary promise who would be able to, again, bring transcendence to the world. Something that is rarely experienced, rarely seen. So Valliere gets onto the ice for her long performance, and the commentators that she cannot hear, obviously, are saying things like, again, she should not be allowed to skate. She's obviously aware, of what's being said, aware of the intensity of the condemnation. Some of the teams, certainly, there were members of the American skate team that were at the rink in the auditorium, that when she went onto the ice, got up and left the arena in protest. There weren't, the crowds were restricted, right? The audience was severely restricted because of COVID. So the chances are, we don't know, but she might easily have been aware of that. So she gets onto the ice, and again, arguably the greatest talent in the history of figure skating fails. She falls repeatedly, she gives her worst performance ever. Certainly since she entered the senior level of competition, her worst performance ever. I was looking forward to Valieva singularly in these Olympics because she was the one athlete that I saw capable of that acme of perfection, that acme of performance, that level that transcended everything that people had imagined possible. And we lost it. Again, no matter who you are, no matter how great your talent, no matter how much you have trained, with insufficient support or sufficient opposition, one can fail. So Valieva failed. Now, at the end of her performance, she goes to her coach, Iteri Tetburitsi, who is now the most celebrated coach in figure skating. Certainly in women's figure skating. She is the main coach of Russian figure skaters. She's been responsible for the success of Medvedeva, of Zagitova. She has produced a revolution in women's figure skating so that the people that she has coached have performed at levels that, again, were not anticipated in our lifetimes. But Valieva represented the acme, the extremity of that coaching accomplishment. She goes to Iteri, and by the way, there are a lot of negative documentaries, videos about Iteri online. I watched a number of them this week, but I also, yesterday, watched a 1-hour interview with Iteri. Not a documentary about her, just an interview where she is talking about her coaching philosophy, and it's extraordinary. I mean, she's, I think, a rare intelligence within that world, and one can see how she has achieved that effect, those results. She made one point that the big picture, the big result depends upon the smallest details, right? As of the sparrow, everything matters. So if you want to have a kind of a reasonable appreciation of Iteri as a coach that runs counter to a lot of what you might otherwise hear about her, I would say go to the source, listen to her, watch her, and I think you'll understand the nature of the success she's able to achieve. And it's not, one hears, abusive, okay? Or at least that's not my sense of it. Well, Iteri said to her something. She didn't embrace her. She said to Valieva something that was in Russian, so I didn't know what it was, but it was soon after translated. And what Iteri had said to her, and actually the fact that Iteri didn't seem to embrace her was later criticized by Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee. I have a photograph of him. He criticized Iteri as being cold, as again, being like abusive. Oh, here is Iteri. And here is Thomas Bach. What Iteri said to Valieva as she left the ice was, "Why did you give up after the axle? Why didn't you fight through?" Now, when I heard that the axel is a jump, it's like 3.5 rotations, she fell performing her axel. It's one of the hard jumps to perform. Okay, she fell. That was the first fall she did, and from that point on, her performance was weak. Again, levels below what she had done previously, and levels below what she's capable of. So when I heard those words, I didn't feel coldness. What I felt was empowerment, that despite the bullying, despite the condemnation, despite the relentless rain of criticism, of literally abuse by commentators, by people commenting on her being able to continue to perform, despite all of that, it was in her power ultimately to triumph, in her power ultimately, no matter what, to rise to the acme, the highest level of performance. That's what her coach was saying. You have that within you. It didn't happen. It didn't happen on that occasion. We lost that acme of performance. We've lost that transcendence. But I thought those words by Iteri to Camilla were comforting, deeply comforting, that you had it within you and you still do. The philosopher Wittgenstein, whom I refer to almost weekly, let me show you this image again. Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher, that's the most important influence upon my philosophical work, was gifted in the sciences. In fact, early in his career, before he turned to philosophy, he was on his way to study physics with the great physicist of the 19th century, Boltzmann, formulator of statistical thermodynamics, one of the great achievements of theoretical science in the 19th century. Boltzmann is one of those individuals that committed suicide. Committed suicide because, again, of insufficient support or sufficient opposition that he did not see his results embraced in his lifetime. And in despair, he committed suicide, and we lost one of the great minds of the 19th century, of any century. Wittgenstein apparently was on his way to study with Boltzmann when he got news of Boltzmann's death. But Wittgenstein had a patent for, I think, a jet engine device, some aspect of a jet engine. He was gifted technologically. He was a powerful mind. Remember Bertrand Russell, who knew everyone in the 20th century, thought that Wittgenstein's was the most powerful mind of that extraordinary century. Well, Wittgenstein remarked repeatedly that he felt it was one of the failures of our time that people only looked to science for instruction, that people felt that we could only learn from science, that we could not learn from the arts, that the arts, that performance could entertain, existed primarily to entertain, but not to teach, not to instruct. Well, at the highest level, at the level of a Camilla Valieva, at the level that she is capable of, at the level that we might have been able to experience were it not for those relentless voices of condemnation. At that level, performance can teach us everything about the world. Performance can solve the world, can certainly inspire us at the level of the greatest or the deepest or the most powerful philosophical insights and results. I've told the story, I'll tell it very briefly now, of Sibelius, the Finnish composer. It's a story that's set in World War II, which I think is appropriate tonight as well, or today as well. It brings together the Olympic experience that I'm commenting on with current events. Sibelius was probably the greatest composer that Finland has produced. He was in Finland during World War II when he was visited by a musicologist, someone who wrote about music, Lucian Price, a celebrated musicologist. Lucian Price went there to speak with him, effectively to interview him, to get his sense of the war, of just life during those very dark times. He wanted the perspective of a great composer. And at some point during the conversation, Sibelius stopped speaking and began humming a section of a trio by Beethoven. And Lucian Price later commented that so long as there is such music in the world, so long as, and I'll add this, there are performances at the level of a Valieva, so long as there is philosophy at the limit of rigor, so long as there are such extremities in the world, there is always something we can do about the worst that the world can do to us. For eternal life is not a duration, it is an intensity. And our pain becomes beauty. Okay, so we have that will conclude tonight's talk. We have some questions from last time that let me address. We have a few minutes, enough time to address them. Oh, there is Sibelius. Okay, so first question, what is the philosophical connection between STEM, the sciences, technology, engineering, math, women, and philosophy from your perspective, from my perspective? Okay. The point I would like to make about this from a philosophical perspective, which is fundamentally my perspective, right? As applies to tonight's talk, as applies to people rushing to judgment, I'll teach you differences. What I think is most valuable about the involvement, the increasing involvement, or you want to encourage increasing involvement, participation of women, in the sciences at the highest levels, is because of what differences might pertain, right? Between any two people, there are differences. Between men and women, there may be differences. There may be differences there might be a perspective that, again, the view is that given any two individuals, there are more differences than similarities. That applies to any two men, that applies to any two women, that applies to any man versus any woman. More differences than similarities. And we can benefit from those differences. An example is, we tend to think in the sciences that there's like a narrow road, like a singular approach to an answer, to a solution. Not true. There are almost always multiplicities of approaches to any solution, any problem. One of the most famous examples is that of what's called the fundamental theorem of algebra. about the nature of solutions to polynomial equations. The first person to prove the fundamental theorem of algebra was Gauss, the great 18th, 19th century German mathematician, considered, along with Newton and Archimedes, one of the three greatest mathematicians in history. Gauss proved the fundamental theorem of algebra, being the first one to do so, then went back and proved it again from a different direction, and then went and proved it again from a different direction, and finally from a fourth direction, all of them different. So I'll teach you differences. The greater the diversity of people engaged in any enterprise, the more different approaches we can see, we can discover to the solution to any given type of problem. So insofar as we're talking about women, as a category, we see them as in distinction to men. Well, again, there is many differences among men as there are among women, and between the two categories, the same applies rigorously. And I think difference is something that can be exploited for advantageous results, multiplicities of results. Now, the other question, how do achievements differ from the past and now? Well, achievement has always been difficult. There's a famous line from the end of Spinoza's Ethics. Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch philosopher. Everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. That is true for every measure of achievement. I've been talking about Valieva. Clearly, the amount of effort, of work going into her level of achievement is extraordinary. That, in general, applies to every mode of achievement. That, in general, nothing great comes easily. And you might think that, well, so much has been accomplished in the past that there's less to accomplish now. No, I did some work with IKEA some years ago. Remember, they were interested in doing with my art, or with art, what they've done with home furnishings. I met with them, and one of the things that they emphasized is their view that there is more to discover. There is more to do than has been done. But it's never easy. It was not easy for Archimedes to do what he did over 2,000 years ago. Now, Newton had the benefit, he talks about how if he's seen further than others, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants. He's had the benefit of people that have come before him. I've had the benefit of Wittgenstein and a whole history of philosophy before me. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't taken me decades of effort, consistent work to achieve my distillations. One can go further, but the amount of effort involved in achieving a result, one might say, is comparable, is at a level to what it has always been. Now, these are heuristic comments, right? They're not rigorous comments because we can't know, right? We can't know in the case of Valieva, what was the ultimate cause of that failure of hers? We can't go back in time and do the experiments. We can't go back in time and see how we might be achieving results relative to how we're able to achieve them today. We can't do the experiments ever. So all of these speculations are purely heuristic. They're not at the level of rigor. But they're a guide. And the upshot of the guide is that one must work hard and persistently with a kind of a purity of dedication and devotion to achieve any result at the levels at which we've been discussing. Okay, I think that concludes the talk and the questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you guys for your questions and all the feedback. So thank you for your Danielle and Eric Moss. Thank you for your feedback. We see that all. And as a regular tradition, I would just read out the questions and the comments, and we would definitely address them next week. Cherno Balde, good morning, Mr. Friedman. Could you tell what the best way to follow to speak English very fast? Okay, thank you. My name is Cherna Balde. I'm an English student. My problem in English is when I want to talk, I don't talk well. Okay. Maybe Stephen Friedman will give you some comments or maybe advices next week. Eric Moss, welcome. Thank you, Eric, for joining us weekly. We truly appreciate it. And the comment from Eric Moss is, at the Olympic trials for the 1988 Olympics, Carl Lewis tested positive for 3 banned stimulants, but the US Olympic Committee covered up the results and he was allowed to compete in the Olympics. How is that any different or worse than what happened with Camila Valieva? Thank
It's
you.
an excellent question because it addresses the issue of I'll teach you differences, and I'll address the differences next time.
Thank you, Eric Moss. Parasat, thank you, Parasat, for joining. I express my gratitude to Mr. Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Then Eric Moss, you say anyone can fail, which is true, but it's not true that almost anyone can succeed given the right conditions.
I will address that next time too, and the point of that is going to be we cannot know in advance.
And then Eric Moss, Nadia, the first perfect 10. Okay.
Yes.
Eric Moss, a philosopher with a background in molecular biology. Nice. I knew there was a reason I enjoyed your talks and admired your insights. Yay.
Oh, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you.
Again, Eric Moss, Stephen Friedman is a true polymath.
Very kind again, Eric. I appreciate it, and I will address your questions next time. Yes.
Joseph Zapata, great topic. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And one more. I think a skater feels defeated if they fall during their routine. I competed at the World Karate Championship and made one mistake during my performance, and I knew that meant I would not win. Okay, super. So one more time, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us weekly. We truly appreciate your talks, and we'll be waiting for you next week. And thank you, the audience, for joining us weekly. We appreciate all the comments. We will address them next week within your questions. Stay safe, have a great week, and see you all next week. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. See you next time. And thank you, Aaliyah, again, always.